Okay, so now we're going to use the sine, sum, and difference identity, and we're going to practice it to simplify expressions with each identity. Now, in the first example, we have an angle, and it's in radians, and then we have a unknown angle that they just use the variable x, and that's okay. We'll just use this x and 2 pi over 3, and we'll just be substituting these values in. So here we go. X is going to be my A, angle A, and 2 pi over 3 is going to be my angle B. And I'll just substitute those angles into our identity formula. So I will have the sine of X times the cosine of 2 pi over 3 plus the cosine of x times the sine of 2 pi over 3. And now what I'm going to do is just substitute into the formula the aspects that I know. The only thing I know is that 2 pi over 3 is an angle on the unit circle, and that means that I know its sine and its cosine value. So 2 pi over 3 is going to have the same sine and cosine as pi over 3. 2 pi over 3 is our angle that falls. If we look at the unit circle, is our pi over 3 angle that falls in quadrant 2, which means that the cosine of this angle is going to be negative. So this will be negative 1/2, and the sine will be radical 3 over 2. So to simplify this, I don't know the sine of x, so this would just be the sine of x times, I know the cosine of 2 pi over 3 is negative 1/2, and then plus the cosine of x times radical 3 over 2. And I can take this a step further and just rewrite this as sine of x times 1/2. So I could say this is negative sine x over 2 plus radical 3 cosine x over 2. And all I did is just multiply straight across for both of those, okay? And that's going to be equal to this value over here, the sine of x plus 2 radical 3. And if I look, I notice I have a common denominator here. So my final thing is going to be, and I'm going to change the color so you can see it. But my final, since I have a common denominator, I can put this all over 2. And I can say this is just the negative sine of x plus radical 3 cosine x. All right, what I encourage you to do is just pause the video, go to B, and I want you to use the sine, and this time we're using the difference formula, and go ahead and plug in and see if you can simplify the value, and then check your work with my work. So I'm going to give you a second. Go ahead and pause the video. Okay, did you get what I got? If we use the sum and difference the difference formula, we would have gotten the sine of pi over 2 times the cosine of theta minus the cosine of pi over 2 times the sine of theta. Now I know the sine of pi over 2 is 1 based on where it's at on the unit circle, and I know the cosine of pi over 2 is 0. So that means that this would be 1 times the cosine of theta minus 0, cosine of pi over 2 is 0, times the sine of theta. And if I simplify this out, the sine would go away, that would cancel, and I'm really just left with 1 times cosine of theta, which is cosine of theta. If you got that, good job. Let's move on. Now this one, they actually give us an expression. They say sine of 75 degrees times cosine of 15 plus cosine of 75 times sine of 15. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it does. It sounds like our sine sum formula. So we're actually going backwards here. So if I simplify this, I could just simplify this and say, hey, what this is saying is this is just the sine of 75 degrees plus 15 degrees, right? And again, all I'm doing is taking what they gave me and I'm going backwards. And if I think about it, 75 plus 15, well, that just equals 90. So this is just asking for the sine of 90 degrees. And I can think about this even further. I know 90 degrees is just on the unit circle. So if I go to the unit circle, 90 degrees is just pi over 2 in degrees, right? So I know the sine of 90 is that y coordinate. It is 1. All right, I want you to pause the video, look at D, see if you can figure out D, and check your work. Okay, did you get what I got? That the sine of 290, that this is just the sum and difference identity. So basically this is saying that this is the sine of 290 minus 50 degrees. And I can just write that backwards in this way, all right? And then from there, I know that that's just saying the sine of 240. Well, we know 240 is an angle on the unit circle. And because it's an angle on the unit circle, I can find its sine value. And from the previous problem that we did, we know the sine of 240 is negative radical 3 over 2. All right, so let's move on, and we're going to talk about the cosine sum and difference identity.